So, yes, Janet wanted me to give my testimony this morning, and I'm happy to be able to do that. The first part of it, I have to say, can be sad and depressing. So I wanted to start on a happy note, so we could have a little laugh at first and settle my nerves a bit. So I just wanted to tell you about Wilbur and Minnie. They were an older couple that lived out in the country, down in the States somewhere. And Wilbur had farmed for many years. He grew up on a farm with his dad, and so he'd work hard out in the fields. And so come the end of the week, he would, after working from sun up to sunset every day on the farm, come Sunday when he went to church, he'd sit in the pew and he'd be relaxed and start to nod off and fall asleep. And then he'd begin to snore. And it really embarrassed his wife, Minnie. So one day when she was at the grocery store, she noticed this bottle of Limburger flavoring or essence. I don't know why anybody would buy such a thing, but anyway. Minnie had a plan for that, so she bought it and dropped it into her purse. And the next Sunday at church, just about when the sermon was going to start, here she noticed her husband nodding off. And she poked him with her elbow, but it didn't do any good. He started to snore. So she took that little bottle out of her purse, took the top off, and held it under his nose. And he had been slouched down, falling asleep. He was asleep and snoring, but he bolted upright, his eyes opened wide, and he shouted for all the church to hear, "Minnie, get your feet on your own side of the bed." So just thought I'd share that with you. I believe, I'm sure we all believe, that God has a sense of humor, right? He wants us to have joy. Actually, he gave us joy. And he says in his word that the joy of the Lord is our strength. So if you feel weakened at all today or at any time, just remember to revive your joy in the Lord. And our joy comes through all the blessings that he gives to us day by day. So there's no excuse not to have joy in our life. So I just wanted to begin by saying that our birth, our life, is God's gift to us. How many believe that our life is a gift from God? Amen. Every breath we take, every single breath, is a gift from him. And the life that we live, who we become, can be our gift back to him. Have you ever thought of that? That your life is a gift from God, but it also can be a gift to him, depending on the way that we live our life? And our life really is a journey from beginning to end. We don't know how long it's going to be, but it is a journey all along the way as we live and grow and mature in him. And as far back as I look into my life from the beginning when I first started to have memory, I guess, probably around 3 years old, I can see God there. Even though he wasn't really a part of our lives, my parents weren't church-going people. They certainly didn't put God in their life at that time, or I don't know if they ever really did. But and you know, that has far-reaching results in the life of a home when God isn't there. But I can see him there as I look back, different times and places. I can see God in my life, even though I didn't really know it then. Helping me to put one foot ahead of the other. Helping me to survive. And helping me to want to live when I really didn't want to, when I wanted to die. I was born near Niagara Falls, actually at the end of the Welland Canal in a small town called Port Colborne. I don't know, I know Pastor Albert lived there at one time. Not the same time as I did, I don't think, so we didn't know one another, but Yeah, it was an exciting place to live and grow up because all the ships from all over the world came through the center of our town. The canal divided the west side from the east side, and it was so exciting to see those ships coming through with the flags and the names on from all over the world, different countries. My parents were young when they got together. I say it was young. My mother was 18, my father was 21. And my father, I don't know about my mother, but my father certainly didn't want to be married at that time. But back then, when a baby was coming, it's the thing that was expected. You married. And so my father felt trapped. He resented being in that marriage. And especially when my brother came along a few months later after they were married, my father's resentment just escalated, and he took it out on my brother, also on my mother. He would beat my mother, beat my brother, just dealing with the rage and the anger that was inside him from his childhood that he had never dealt with. And then when my older brother was 3, I was born along with my twin brother, and my father's anger even grew more. My mother told me, I don't know why she would tell me this, but she said that my father said I didn't even want one more, let alone 2. And so about 3 months after we were born, my twin brother mysteriously passed away. And my siblings and I have always felt that my father ended his little life. I mean, how hard would it be to snuff out the life of a little 3-month-old baby? And so we're certain that, knowing my father's anger and rage, that he ended my brother's life. But I don't question that. I'm thankful that all of these years he's been with the Lord. I believe as a little baby he went straight to be with Jesus. And knowing how I rebelled when I got into my young teenage years, and him being a boy, I know he would have rebelled. How many think boys are worse than girls? Anyway, drugs were coming in then, and being a boy, I'm almost certain I would have lost him then after I'd known him for years. So I'm thankful that he went to be with the Lord when he was a baby and didn't suffer the life of our home during those young years. As I said, I would see my father's violence almost daily when I was a little girl and as I grew. And sometimes as he would get so overwhelmed with just not wanting to live in that home, he would start up his motorcycle. I would hear it starting, and I'd hear it roar out of the driveway and down the street. And I would be so happy, and I would wish he'd never come back. But he always did come back, sometimes a few days later, sometimes he'd be gone for a week or more. But he'd always come back, and the rage would be there still. And yet, he could be so nice at times. I remember times when we lived on a long street with a lot of kids on that street, and we didn't have to go to a park or anywhere to see fireworks. Whenever it was the day, times when you would have fireworks, my father would buy the biggest display in town, and he would have them right at our house on our long street. All the kids would come, and my father was just like a big kid, and he'd get so excited about seeing the fireworks burst in the sky in all their colors. And we'd have games at our house, games of Monopoly and different games. Kids would come and play. My father would play, and of course he always won, but it was so much fun. And he'd sit me on his lap, and he'd play for me because I was too small to play. And I would always be excited because I would win, even though I was the smallest kid there, because of him, that I would win. And we'd go on picnics because we lived on Lake Erie. Lake Erie is right at the end of the Welland Canal. We'd go for picnics to the beach, beautiful beaches all along Lake Erie, and just so many fun things. But at the snap of your fingers, he could change so suddenly, and sometimes we never knew why. But that rage would build inside of him, and he would just explode in anger and rage and take it out on mostly my mother and my older brother, sometimes me. So it was like my father was two different people. He could be such a nice man. When we were out in public, everybody thought he was so nice. They didn't know what happened behind our doors at home. And yet he could be this terrible, fearsome person. And I became like two people. I remember it so well, being a little girl and being like two people. Around my father, I was timid, afraid, full of fear, and as perfect as I could be so that he wouldn't get angry with me. And yet I could be bold and bad and wild with my mother because it was the fear, the anger, everything that was inside of me that came out when I knew I was safe with my mother. I would throw myself down in public places and throw a tantrum, kick and scream. I have scars. I split my chin open one time in the grocery store, throwing a tantrum and banging my head up and down on the floor. I have scars on my face, different places, from just mutilating myself through the anger that was within me. Or not anger, but fear that was within me. And so I was like two different people, and I didn't know how to be any different. And I lived like that, alone in the only child in the house, until my younger brother came along when I was 6. Because my brother was taken out of our home when he was 7, just because he was beaten so badly that he had to be in Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto for 6 months with head injuries from my father. I remember so vividly, my father would pick him up by one leg and throw him across the room. His head would hit the wall and he'd slump on the floor whimpering, and my father would still go after him. Just a little boy, from the time I could remember, from the time I was 3 until he left our home when he was 7. That was his life. And so after he came home from Sick Children's when he was 7, he wasn't allowed to come to our home anymore. I don't know who said he couldn't, whether it was my father's parents or the hospital, I don't know, but he had to go and live with my father's parents. And I was so sad to see him go. I missed him. I was alone then, the only child then in the home, like I said, until my brother was born when I was 6. And yet I was happy for him, so happy that he didn't have to be beaten anymore. He did live close by me, only a few blocks away, so we did get together, which was nice. So then, like I said, when I was 6, my younger brother Keith was born. And my older brother's name was Wayne, and then my brother Keith was born. And I became a little mother when I was 6 years old. Not really that I did so much for him, because I was only 6, but just the protection that I felt for him. Every time there was a fight, I would just get him from wherever he was and keep him with me, and we'd make ourselves scarce not to be around my father when he was beating our mother. But of course we could hear everything. And then when I was 9, my sister was born, and I truly became a mother. I was her mother, even though I was only 9 years old. It's not like my mother came home and said, "Here, this is your baby," but she was my baby. She was my daughter as well as my sister. And I did everything for her, everything. And I felt so responsible and protective for both of them. And all 3 of us slept in one bed. My sister never slept in a crib. There was a crib there for her, but from the time she came home from the hospital, she never slept in it. She always was with me on one side of me, and my brother was on the other side of me, the 3 of us in my bed. And at nights when a fight would break out, usually once a week or so, mostly on the weekends, but we never knew when, they would just cling to me. They would be just pinching me so hard on the sides, just out of fear. They'd both wet the bed. I'd wake up soaked in the mornings from the fear that my brother, actually, my younger brother, I know he would not like me telling you this, but he wet the bed till he was 15 years old. And that was purely emotional, the fear and anxiety that was inside of him. And I had to be strong. I was so weak emotionally, but I had to be strong while so scared. And one night in particular, I remember a certain fight. There were so many, all through those years, but one stands out in my mind. Not that I think about it very often, but I remember this one night, the three of us were in bed, and of course we were already awake because we would always hear the fight start downstairs, and then we heard a commotion coming up the stairs, and my father was dragging my mother, pulling her up the stairs into my bedroom, where the three of us were laying in bed pretending to be asleep, and he turned on the light and told us to sit up in bed and watch what our mother deserved. And he put her up against the wall, I remember, and drove his knee repeatedly into her stomach until she fell on the floor. And then he kept pulling on her long hair so her head was banging up and down on the floor, face down. And that was the only time I ever did anything. I always felt so defenseless. I mean, what could I do with a grown man beating my brother and my mother? But that time, my father was straddling my mother. He was on her back, on his knees, pulling her head up and down, smashing it into the floor. And I jumped out of bed and started jumping on the backs of his legs and shouting at him, yelling at him to stop. And I think he just was out of it. I don't even think he realized what he was doing. And suddenly he became aware of what he was doing, and he stopped. And I believe that maybe I saved my mother's life that night. I don't know. But, and so like most of all the other fights, my father went to bed and just slept. He just seemed to go into a deep sleep. And my mother and my brother and sister and I would throw a few things in my brother's wagon, and we'd flee down the street to her parents' home, where we would stay for a few days until my father would come, beg my mother to come back, and he'd say that things would be different, it would never happen again. And of course my mother would go back. Back then, there wasn't the help for women that there is now. And what could a woman do? I mean, if she left, where would she go? She didn't have a happy childhood. Every time we went to her parents' house when we had to flee, we weren't happy there. Her parents only took us in because what else could they do? But they didn't want us there, really. We could feel it. So my mother always went back, and of course it was always the same. And back then, I remember how much I loved school. I loved being away from home, but mostly I loved school, where I did well, and I loved my teachers, and I used to pretend that they were my mother and that they loved me and cared about me. I loved the praise and attention I got at school when I did well and did well on exams and things, and I was always afraid to go home. After school, a lot of kids would stay and play baseball or just talk or just hang around the school. Maybe some of them had home lives like I had, I don't know. But I remember I was pretty much always the last one to leave. Everyone else was gone, and I'd slowly walk home, never really knowing what to expect when I got there, never knowing if my mother would even still be alive. The fighting never stopped. It never stopped. There were holes in the walls in pretty much every room. And I would get my younger brother and sister, and I would too. We'd color pictures in coloring books and tape them over the holes. But sometimes the holes were too big to cover. I mean, how can you get a coloring book big enough to cover? For instance, the time my father got so angry, he threw one of the kitchen chairs through the wall and cracked it all up and made a big hole. And it was a rented house. I was always afraid of what the landlord would think of our house if he ever came in and saw all the holes everywhere. But of course, all our neighbors knew. They could hear. Sometimes my father would even start beating up my mother outside. And like I said, back then, nothing was really done. I remember the police coming to our home a few times, and just look at us sadly and have to leave because my mother would never press charges. And back then, if you didn't press charges, they couldn't do a thing. Nowadays, they come in and the perpetrator is just taken away, no questions asked. But it wasn't like that back then. I remember times when my mother was beaten up so badly that she'd be laying on the couch. I don't even know where my father would be at those times, but she would be just moaning and groaning, full of bruises, sometimes cuts. And she would want me to get things in the house that were flat, like tea towels and scarves, and just wrap her up. I guess just the feeling of that she would feel soothed, that she would feel cared about. And so I would do that. I would kneel on the floor beside her and wrap her arms and legs, and I would really feel such love for her and feel so sorry for her. And I would tell her that. I would tell her how much I loved her. I would write her little notes and tell her how much I loved her. And I can remember putting at the bottom of the note, "Do you love me?" And then I would have a dotted line, and I would put sign on the dotted line. And she'd always put yes. And so I grew up feeling that our mother loved us. And one night, I remember after a big fight, I went to my bedroom and I saw my father. Their bedroom door I had to pass theirs to go to my bedroom. The door was opened and I saw my father sitting on the edge of their bed crying. He had his head in his hands and he was sobbing. And it just, I couldn't believe it. I had never seen my father cry. I had only seen him make other people cry. Never saw him cry. And I just couldn't figure it out. But in later years, and even now, I realize that my father wasn't just full of anger and rage. He was full of hurt and pain from his childhood. And I'm sure he felt awful about how he treated our family. And he didn't know how to change. He just didn't know what to do and kept doing that over and over and over. I'm sure he wanted to be happy. He wanted to be different, but he didn't know how. And then at age 14, when I was 14, my father left. He left to live with another woman, and they were actually friends of our family. Their children played with myself and my siblings, and my father went to live with them. And I was so happy. I remember feeling so relieved and so happy that now the violence was over. We could be happy without him, but it only lasted for a little while. And then I could see that we were losing our mother. She started going out with other men. I didn't understand it then. I thought she would be with us and be able to be a proper mother to us, that she'd be able to cook and clean and do the things that a mother does for her family that she hadn't really been able to do in years, that I was doing as best as I could. But she was going out with men, staying longer and longer with them, sometimes not coming home for a couple of weeks, because she knew she could depend on me. I had been a little mother all along. I had been cooking just simple things like soup and sandwiches, but she knew I could keep us going and keep things going until she came back. And she'd stay away longer and longer. And I remember, I'm just going to add in a little funny part right here, because I know it's been kind of depressing until now. But I remember one time, my mother started going with this particular man that she ended up actually living with until they both passed away. But she started going with this man named George, who moved into my best friend's house. They had an apartment upstairs, and he moved in there, and my mother started going with him. And and one of the things I used to make when I was living like that, I would make homemade fries. There was always potatoes in our house, and I would cut up fries, and I would, back then we had fluffo. Anyone familiar with fluffo? They're like, it's shortening. I would melt that shortening, the fluffo, and I would cut the potatoes and make homemade fries, and I just loved them. I still love fries. Anyway, I opened the fridge door one time to get the fluffo out, and I noticed this plastic bag in the fridge. So I opened it to see what was in it. And my mother she didn't wash or iron our clothes. I was doing that for me and my brother and sister. But here I saw some shirts of George's, dampened and rolled up, ready in the fridge, ready for her to iron for George. And I didn't like to see that. I was so upset that she would be looking after him like that, ironing his shirts and not even doing our clothes. So I had my fries, and I when the shortening cooled enough that it wasn't real hot, I opened that bag and poured that grease all in the bag. And it's one thing, I never heard a word from my mother. I'm sure, the shirts would have been encased in, fluffo, when it hardens, it would have been solid grease. She had to have, of course, see that, and she never said a word. And she would have known it was me, and I'm sure she understood why I did that. And it's one thing I did when I was a teenager that I really feel that God understood and probably didn't hold me account for that. And then my mother came home one day, and she said to me, "Debbie, George wants me to come to live with him." And just the way she said, he wants me to come and live with him. I said, "Well, what about us?" And she said, "Well, George really doesn't want kids." So she phoned my father and had him come and get us, which devastated me, because I thought, how could she? How could she send us away? How could she send us to live with someone she knew was so violent? And yet she did, and he came. He came, and I remember holding on to the edge of the door frame, refusing to go with him. I kept telling him I wasn't going. I didn't want to live with him. I didn't know, I guess I hadn't thought it through, that what was I supposed to do then when my mother didn't want us anymore. But I just absolutely refused and told him I wasn't going. So I don't know if you can guess how he got me to go, easily got me to go. He put my younger brother and sister in the car. And so then I just followed, because I wasn't going to let they were like my children, go without me. So I got in the car and we went. And we lived with him and his common-law wife for about a year, and it was horrible, just horrible, because her children had their mother there. Although my father never beat her up or any of her children, but he could be mean. But his meanness came out mostly to me and my brother and sister when we moved there, because they had their mother to protect them and to be with them and speak up for them, and we had no one. So the violence went on for us. I remember one time my father bought BB guns for her two sons and my younger brother. He would have been 8 because I was 14, and my sister would have been 5. And after that, when we left my father's within a year, my sister was 5 and never had parents again. We never had parents to be parents to us ever again. But my father had bought each of the boys a BB gun, and the windshield out of my father's car got smashed. And so my brother was the one to be blamed, although who knows whose BB it was that hit the windshield. But my father took my brother up to the loft in an outside shed and threw him down to the cement floor below. And I was looking out my bedroom window, which faced that shed, and hearing my brother's screams. And the next day I phoned my mother, and I told her what happened. And I said, "You've got to come and get us, because my father's going to kill one of us." So she said, "Okay, you be ready this Saturday at 1 o'clock, and George and I will come and get you." and get us. And we waited, and I see it's 12 o'clock already, so I'm going to try to wrap it up. So she told me to be ready at 1 that Saturday. And so I put all of our stuff in one suitcase that we had, a big suitcase, and hid it under my bed. And I told my younger brother and sister not to tell her children or anyone. And then that Saturday, both of them worked, my father and this woman. And we went outside. We were living on a country road in Port Colborne, and we went out earlier than 1 o'clock and sat and waited. And every time we heard cars coming, tires coming down up the road, I would think it was them. And 1 o'clock came, 2 o'clock came, 3 o'clock, and by 4 o'clock, I knew they weren't coming. And I wished with all my heart that she would have said they couldn't come, rather than to say they were coming and didn't come. Because that moment, I know, that moment, that day, a hatred and a bitterness and an anger came into my life, into my heart, that I hadn't really had before. My life, I accepted it. It's what it was. It was normal for me. Yes, I could be angry with my father, but this anger, this bitterness, this hatred that came into my life so abruptly that day was more than I think anyone could hate anyone. The hatred that I had for my mother that day. And it was because of the betrayal. Because I thought she loved us. I felt so betrayed, so abandoned by her, that this hatred rose up in me and took hold of me. And I didn't even realize at that time how dangerous that was. I didn't know anything about spiritual things. I had no idea. I felt so justified. I felt that she deserved it. I didn't know any other way to feel than to hate her like that. And so that hatred just grew and grew in me to the point where it could have destroyed me. And I started to rebel. Up until then, I was such a good young girl, but filled with that hatred, filled with that anger. I started hanging around with kids that felt the same way, doing the things that they did, doing all sorts of things that were not the real me, that I kept hidden inside to keep from getting hurt anymore. I got into such sin that I won't even tell that in detail, but I can just say that I became a very sinful, very lost young girl that didn't even want to live. The only reason I kept putting one foot ahead of the other was for my brother and sister and my older brother. I wanted to live for them, but no other reason. And then, so everything kind of fell apart. There's so much I could tell, but there's not enough time. Everything fell apart at my father's with his common law woman. They actually moved away, and I had to find homes for me and my younger brother and sister. I went to live at my grandmother's and grandfather's, my mother's parents, who didn't really want me. I was 15 then, I guess, almost 16. And so they didn't really want me. They only took me out of obligation, but of course they couldn't take my younger brother and sister. So they went to distant relatives in Brantford, hours away from me. It was like my children were ripped out of my life. Didn't know when I'd see them again. And those were the two I lived with my grandparents till I was 18. And they were the two saddest years of my life, even sadder than my whole life before that, because I had lost everything. I had lost my parents, such as they were, but they were still my parents. I had lost my home. I lost my younger brother and sister because that were like my children. I wasn't with my older brother. I just had lost everything, and I felt like I had no reason to live. I really did want to end my life, but never did, because I always felt like someday I'll get together with my younger brother and sister again. I had to be alive for them. I began to hate myself. I'd look in the mirror in the morning as I was getting ready for school, and I hated myself. I hated to look in the mirror and see the person that I was. My best friend's mother would tell me she could see the devil in my eyes. And I guess it was the hatred, the anger, the bitterness that was in me so strongly. And so one night, and every night that I'd go to sleep when I was living at my grandparents' those 2 years, I'd go to sleep and I would just cry myself to sleep. I remember the tears would just run right down my neck and soak my pillow, just crying from hopelessness and wondering what would become of all of us kids. And but one night, I remember, one night in particular, and I don't know why it was, I began to pray. I didn't know God at all, really. I didn't know much about him, and I didn't really know Jesus. I guess I had heard about him, but I didn't know anything about them, didn't know anything about the Bible. But I began to reach out and talk to God. And just, I guess because I felt like of anybody in the whole universe, he alone would understand what I felt like, what I was going through, and how I felt that I didn't want to live. And I started telling him all that. Every night I'd cry myself to sleep and talk to God. And it became that God, even though I couldn't see him, that he felt more close to me than anybody around me. He really did. He felt so close. Some people say that people that pray that aren't a child of God, that God doesn't hear them. That's not true. It isn't true at all. God delights to have people that don't know him start to talk to him, because that's how he can talk to them and begin to help them. And I had 2 prayers, I remember. My first prayer was that God, please somehow get me back with my younger brother and sister. I missed them so terribly. And my second prayer was, God, please help me to be a better person. I knew I was being rebellious and sinful, and I didn't like it. I just didn't know how else to be. I'd get with my friends, and that's the things that we would do. And so those were the 2 things I prayed for, not knowing how they'd even be answered. But I believed, and I never stopped praying. For 2 years, I prayed those 2 prayers. And I never felt that it was taking too long. And as I look back now, if God would have answered my prayer right then about being together with my younger brother and sister, I was only 16, 17, and 18. I was still going to high school. If he would have given me my younger brother and sister then, what would I have done with them? I mean, I was too young to have a place of my own, that my grandparents didn't want them. It wasn't the right time. But when I was 18, when my older brother was 21, it was the right time. And God began to answer both of my prayers in ways that I never would have dreamed possible. So he answered my first prayer first, to get my younger brother and sister and I back together. I was still living at my mother's parents, but my brother was still living at my other grandparents, but my grandfather had passed away, and my grandmother had she had a bit of dementia, I guess Alzheimer's, but and she also had diabetes really badly, and she was put into the hospital, and she was told, or my brother was told, she'd never come home again. And that was my brother's home. He had lived there from the time he was 7. He was supposed to, the home was going to be left to him. He had seen it in my grandfather's will that my grandfather had shown him. And so my brother talked to me, and he said, I feel like I want to go ask Granny if you could come and live in the house, and we could get our younger brother and sister, and the 4 of us live in the house. She couldn't come back to it anymore. And so I went with them. We went and asked my grandmother in the hospital, and he asked her that, and she said sure, she'd be happy, because for the first time in our lives, the 4 of us would be together. My younger brother and sister had never lived with my older brother. And I hadn't lived with him since he was 7. And so we were so happy. I was so happy leaving my other grandparents' home, went over to my other grandparents' home and lived there. We found our younger brother and sister. We went and got them in Brantford and brought them there. So the 4 of us were together in my grandparents' home. And we were so happy. So happy. We had no parents to tell us what to do. We just had fun all the time. My older brother worked. I did the housework and cooking as much as I could cook back then. I wasn't the greatest cook, but we kept things going, and we were so happy. But it wasn't to last. But how many of you know that out of trouble, out of trials, out of sorrows, God brings joy, and God lots of times answers your prayer through that. It's where we grow and we become more like Him. But we didn't realize it. My older brother, my father had one sister, and we didn't realize it, but we found out later, actually had resented my brother living with her parents, like his grandparents, all those years. She resented it because she saw how my brother was treated like a son. He was actually favored and treated better than her children. And she resented that, and no one really ever knew it. There's no way she could have let her parents know that. They would not have accepted that. But anyway, it came out, and then even more so, she resented it that now my brother had brought me and our younger brother and sister into that home that she felt should be her home. I don't even know if she knew that it was in the will that my brother was to get the home, and she and my father were to get money. And because my grandparents were pretty well off, they owned their own business, drapery and aluminum window and door business and awnings. And so behind the scenes, she was plotting to get us out of the house. So one night she came late at night when my brother was at work and threw us out of the house. It was the end of March, and there was snow on the ground. It was actually snowing out, and she actually came when my brother was at work and told us we had to get out. And I remember telling her that we had gone to Granny, her mother, and asked her if it was okay to come and us 3 come and be in her home. And she said yes. And but she just kept saying, no, you have to leave. This is my mother's house, and you can't stay here. So we didn't know our rights. We found out later that all we would have had to do was call the police, that you cannot put people out in the snow with nowhere to go. But we didn't know that. We got out. I called my brother. He came home from work, and we got out of the house, and only with what was ours. And we drove around and around the town, and my older brother, we were all crying, and my brother said, I don't know what to do, where to go. We had nowhere to go. Felt like no one wanted us. And finally, my older brother said, there's only one place I know to go. And he took us to the Pentecostal minister's home. And it was exactly where God wanted him to take us. And I didn't want to go because I felt like, back then, I felt like a minister was the next thing to God, and I had become so rebellious and sinful, I didn't feel worthy to even be in the presence of a minister, but we had to go somewhere, so we went there. And so they kept us overnight, and then the next morning, that minister took my older brother to the police, and they went to my aunt's house, and in that night, she had completely emptied out the home, took everything out of the home. She was preparing to sell it. and the police told her she had to bring back what we needed to live, table and chairs, beds, dishes. She had to bring that back and let us stay in the house. He couldn't go so far as to tell her that she couldn't put us out at all, but he said, you have to give them time to find a place. And so she did. She had to bring back those things. And we were looking for a place that we could afford, and we couldn't find anything right then. And a couple weeks or so later, the minister came by and asked us to come with him in his car. And we thought he was just taking us out for a drive just to make us feel better. But he drove us to a duplex out on the highway of our town. It was like a duplex side-by-side apartment, and the one apartment, the people had moved out just not long before. And people in that church, in that Pentecostal church in Port Colborne, those people owned that duplex. And in those 2 or 3 weeks that we were looking for a place and couldn't find one, the people of that church, who I didn't know, they were strangers to me, they had gotten together, they completely painted that apartment, they filled it with furniture, dishes, everything that a family would need to live. And so the minister drove us out the highway and stopped at that place, told us to come with him, and he went up to the door, and I was wondering what was happening because I knew it wasn't his house. We had stayed there the night we were put out. And he took a key and opened the door, and he told my brother, he said, now this place, he didn't say this till we were leaving. He took us in, the first room we came to was the kitchen. And he opened the fridge door, it was full of food. The cupboards were full of brand new dishes, and there were brand new pots and pans. Some of the things, the fridge was not brand new, but there was nothing that was junk. Everything was nice or brand new. There were pictures on the wall, flowering flower pots, plants on the windowsill. And I remember looking at the kitchen wall, there was a plaque that said, I will never leave you or forsake you. And somehow I just knew that those were words from God, even though I didn't know anything about the Bible. And then he took us, there was a little dining room area where there was table and chairs, and into the living room where there was a TV and a sectional chocolate brown sofa set and coffee table and end tables, and a beautiful hand-painted lamp that we have in our living room today, right, Leslie? And we didn't know what came from who. No one said, I gave you this, I gave you this. We didn't know where anything came from, who it was from. All we knew was that every room was furnished beautifully. And then he took us upstairs. There was a bedroom for my 2 brothers. They each had a bed with homemade beautiful quilts on them. And then into one room for my sister and I. The beds were brand new, mattresses and these beautiful quilts. And then the last room, he had taken us to the basement where there was a washer and a dryer, and there was 2 bushel baskets, I remember, both filled with sand. One was full of beets and one was full of carrots. And but the last room he took us to upstairs was the bathroom. And I remember as soon as he opened the door, my eyes went right to a pair of pale blue, just really pale blue hand towels on the towel rack. And I remember looking at them, just staring at them, and on the bottom of these towels there was, I'm looking at Sharon, and Sharon, you know my testimony, you've heard it a couple of times. Remember how I've told about those towels, how they weren't just plain towels. Some lady in that church who I never ever knew who, had taken the time to sew about an inch and a half lace was sewn on the bottom of those towels. And I can't explain it, but it was like you could reach out and hold the love in your hands, the love of those people that did this for us. Furnished those rooms with all those things, and especially those towels spoke of the love. I didn't really feel it. And I'm reminding you that my life was anything but love at that point. It was full of rage and anger and bitterness. All the things I saw in my father had become a part of me because of what I had lived through, and because of the betrayal of my mother. I didn't know any love except the love I had for my younger brother and sister that I couldn't even show because they weren't with me for over 2 years. But I could feel the love. I could see it, feel it in those towels and in the whole place. And then I burst out crying. I was just sobbing. And the minister said to my brother, he said, "You don't have to feel obligated." He said, "Everything here is yours to keep. And the first 2 months' rent is paid." And he said, "You don't have to feel obligated, but I want to tell you that if you and your brother and sister ever feel like you want to come to our church, I can tell you, you will be welcome." And so then he left. And I said to my brother, I remember telling him, "I don't know about you, but I want to go to that church and see these people that did this for us." Because our own parents didn't want us. My grandparents didn't ever really want me living there. It seemed like nobody wanted us in this whole wide world. At least that's how we felt. Our aunt didn't want us. She threw us out of the only home we really had. And so it was like, now we felt like there are some people in this world that care about us. And I wanted to go and see them. And little did I know that that's how God was going to answer my second prayer of wanting to become a better person. So that began when we went to church that Sunday. That next Sunday morning, the 4 of us went to church. And as much as I wanted to meet those people, they wanted to meet us. They wanted to see these 4 young people that they had done this for, and they didn't know us either. And so they were all lined up, ready to meet us. And we were all crying. They were crying. We were crying. And church was late. But that evening was the evangelistic service. And so we went. And I remember hearing for the first time in my life the gospel message. I'd never heard it before, that Jesus had died for me, that, all that's said in an evangelistic service. And I knew, as soon as I heard it, I knew God was calling me. That's what I had been asking him for 2 years, praying that prayer. God, help me to be a better person. This was my answer. God would help me be a better person if I would just follow him, if I would accept him as my Savior, that knowing that he died for me, that someone loved me enough to die for me, it just so spoke to me that was God. And so I went forward that night, all 4 of us did, and gave our lives to the Lord. And that began a 15-year journey for me of healing. I know it might sound incredible to you that it would take 15 years for someone to get rid of every ounce of hatred and anger and bitterness that had built up in all those years. But it did take that long for me to really layer by layer, it's like peeling of an onion, to become the person that I can stand here before you today. If you would have known me back then, when I was in my rebellious years, so sinful, you would not have known that was me. I was a totally different person. And now I can stand here telling you that God completely changed my life, changed who I was, changed the direction of my life. I was going so far off that way, and he put me on a new road going towards him. And part of my healing, actually, he did it right at the very beginning because he knew he had to. One day I was really praising God. I was down in that basement where the 2 bushel baskets were of beets and carrots, and I was doing laundry, and I was really crying. It was probably so early on, probably less than a month after I had come to know him. And I still didn't know all that much about him, didn't know much about the Bible, but we were going to church each Sunday, which would have only been 3 or 4 Sundays. So I didn't know a whole lot. I didn't know that was in the Bible about Peter denying the Lord 3 times and telling him that he did love him. I didn't know that was in there, but I began, as I was doing laundry, just your first love as a Christian, it's so strong. And I began telling the Lord how much I loved him. And I was just praising him and thanking him for what he had saved me from. And the tears were coming down my face. And in my head, I couldn't hear it out loud. I never heard God's voice, didn't see him, but in my head, as I was telling him I loved him, I could hear him questioning me, do you really love me? And I'd say, yes, Lord, I love you so much. I'm so thankful for what you've done for me. And I'd hear it again inside my head, do you really love me? And I would tell him it all over again. I think I would have told him that all day long if he would have kept asking me. But the 3rd time, when I felt him asking me in my head, do you really love me? And I said, yes, Lord, I love you so much. This is what I heard in my head. Then love your mother. And it just shocked me because I really felt that God hated her too. I knew he knew what she had done to us, that she had left us for a man, that she didn't care that we never had a home and parents again. I knew God must have known that. And I felt justified to hate her. I felt that God would understand that. I never would have expected him to expect me to love her. But I knew I heard that. I knew so strongly I heard it. And I couldn't deny it. And I couldn't escape it. I couldn't ignore it. I had to do something about it. And it spoke to me that if he wanted me to love my mother, then he must love her. And isn't that God? He loved my mother no matter what she did. He loved me no matter what I did. I had no reason not to forgive her. And so it didn't happen overnight. It didn't, but eventually it did. And I remember saying to God, yes, Lord, I want to obey you. I want to do what you want of me. But that love is gone. She said, when you throw love away like that and it's like it's severed, how do you get it back? And the only way I ever could was for God to give me a new love for her, which was more like an understanding. I began to see her more through God's eyes than through my own. And I began to see that, we don't see people like God sees them. God sees their heart. And God started to kind of help me to see that my parents didn't sit down one day and say, hey, let's hurt our kids. It wasn't that way. It was that we got hurt from the choices they made. Just like the choices we make may hurt someone else, we have to be responsible for how we live our lives. And I realized then, when I became his child, that if I ever was to do anything good, we can all say this about ourselves. If I ever was to do anything good, if he could ever use my life, I had to get rid of the anger and the bitterness and the unforgiveness that was in my heart. Until I did, it would color every relationship I would have ever had in my life. I would never have been able to be a wife. I would have never been able to be a mother to my children that God gave me. I couldn't have, holding on to that hatred and bitterness and anger and unforgiveness. How could I have ever been the wife and mother I've been able to be? Not that I've been perfect by any means, but at least my heart was right. And I can stand here today and say that I'm healed, I'm healthy, and I'm whole. Sure, I still make mistakes, but I'm healthy. I'm healthy in the way that God wants us to be healthy, free of all those negative things that can so consume us and cause us to not be the way he wants us to be. And also for many years, I wanted an apology from my parents. I wanted it not just for me, but for my 2 brothers who are still so damaged today. They are completely damaged. they're not even in touch with me because they're so damaged, and we used to be so close. But I wanted an apology for them. I wanted it for my sister. I wanted it for me, and we never got it. Neither one of my parents ever told us they were sorry, and they're both passed away now. And for years, it was like an open sore within me that never healed. And I always felt like, oh, if only they could say they're sorry, everything will be fine. I'll be fine. But it's not like that. You know, it's not apologies that we need. And I can truly stand here today and say, I don't need that apology anymore. I have God's love. I have a bit of his understanding. Like I said, that my parents didn't deliberately want to hurt us. I try to, there's still things I don't understand, but that's okay. God doesn't ask us to understand. He only asks us to trust. And so I do trust him. I trust him I even trust him that my parents are with him somehow, because I know he loved them. Like I said, he wouldn't have asked me to love my mother if he didn't love her himself. Teresa, right now, if you want to put Psalms, your mom asked me to let you know the scriptures, Psalms 27:10. It says, when my father and mother forsake me, then the Lord will take care of me. He has proven that in my life. Janet mentioned, and I didn't even know she was going to do that, about the newsletter from Jabez Blanket Ministry. It's actually a ministry to orphans around the world, mostly in the Ukraine, Romania, just different places where they send backpacks full of love. The first thing when an orphan opens that backpack, the first thing they see is a smiling teddy bear face. And what better expression of love than a teddy bear, right? And so I'm honored to be the secretary of that ministry and have been for quite a few years now. And so, like Janet said, when you give to a ministry like that, you're helping someone to feel loved, someone to know the love of God. A gospel child's tract goes into every backpack as well when they go around the world. And I'm so thankful that I've known that I didn't have a mother and father after, you might as well say I was an orphan. My siblings were, and I know the care, the love that God shows to people who don't have parents and to other people. Anyone who needs his love, he outpours it. We mustn't let anything hold us back. We need to forgive in order to be free in Christ. He needs us. He's counting on us. We're his hands and his feet, his very expressions of love in this world. And who better to know how to love others than ones who have been touched by his love themselves and forgiven? We can't withhold that from others. I always say, Janet and all of us that volunteer downstairs, we have prayer at the beginning every time. People come in downstairs that are hurting like I used to be, like many of you maybe have hurt in your life. And he's using us, he wants to use us to minister to them, to be sensitive to their hurts and their pain. And if we've never been hurt, how do we know what it's like? And so it's not a bad thing to have some hurt in our life. Some people have even said to me, Debbie, trust that someday God can take away those memories. I don't want God to take away those memories. They don't hurt me anymore. They don't destroy me like they used to, because I'm free. I'm free in Christ, and I'm healed, and I'm whole. But I use those memories. I remember what it's like to be hurt and alone and feeling hopeless and feeling like nobody cares. I want to know that feeling so that I can feel it when I want to be sensitive to someone else feeling that way. And I want to be able to show them God's love like I was shown through those church people. And if that memory isn't strong in me, I maybe wouldn't care or at least not as much. And so I want to. I don't want God to erase my memory. Because if he erases my memories of bad things, then maybe my memory of good things would go as well. And I have a lot of good memories from my childhood. There was some happiness there too, and joy, and it all mixes together, God says. He uses the bad and the good, and somehow he mixes it together and makes something beautiful out of it. And he turns our mourning into joy. It's like a cake. Have you ever tasted vanilla? The vanilla flavoring? Have you ever tasted it? It's horrible. I remember my father gave me a good gulp of it one time because he was making eggnog, and he used to make his own eggnog at Christmas time, and I could smell that smell of the vanilla he was pouring into it, and I wanted a taste, and he gave me a big spoonful, and it was awful. And I thought, how can it smell so good and taste so bad? But that goes into a cake. And the flour, you wouldn't want to eat that flour alone, you know? But all that stuff goes into making a delicious cake. And that's like God. Everything about our life, the good, the bad, the ugly, the joyful, the sorrowful, it all goes together. And somehow, we don't know how, but God brings good out of it. And he makes our life what it can be in him. Some of you, I hope not, but some of you may be struggling with unforgiveness as you sit here this morning. I know it's so easy to do because I've been there, and even sometimes still, I have to forgive whether I want to or not. It's not an easy thing to do. And we can't do it alone, especially if you've been really hurt deeply. You can't do it alone. I think it's impossible. You have to have God to help you. We can't cover up the hurt and the pain from the past or the present. It's got to be dealt with. It's got to be brought to the surface and offered to God, and we need to trust him to help us through it. We need our wounds, the wounds of this life. This life can be so painful, even with God. And we need to turn those wounds into wisdom. And the wisdom is seeing people through God's eyes and not our own. And that can make all the difference. The wisdom of not trying to understand everything. Sometimes we feel we have to understand everything. We can't. If we understood everything, we'd be as wise as God. He doesn't want us, he doesn't ask us to understand everything. Even the things about our own life. There's things we may never understand until we see him face to face. And once we see him face to face, we might not even care anymore about having answers to certain things about this life. It'll be enough just to be with him, living in his joy for the rest of our lives. We need to surrender all. I'm just about finished. We need to surrender all. Get rid of everything negative. Get rid of it. Cast it out of your life and give it to the Lord. We can't judge. We don't know what someone else is going through or what they're suffering. Like I said, the person that I was years ago when I was going through my rebellion, nobody would have seen the hurting, the hurt and pain that was inside of me, because they'd have to look back beyond that hard exterior that I had put upon myself, so no one would really see how I was hurting. And there are a lot of people that you rub shoulders with like that. You don't know the hurt that's in their heart. They may come across as being cruel and mean and hurtful, but inside, they might be so different. And when they laid their heads on their pillows at night, they might be crying. And so we need to be sensitive to that when we see people in our life. We need to have the wisdom to respond to God's gentle voice, his desire to work in our lives, to let him be the potter and us be the clay that we can be molded. To let him set us free so we can be everything he plans for us to be, so that he can use us. Our wounds can turn us to God, to our loving Father. And then there's Jeremiah 1:5, Teresa. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I never knew it when I was a child, but now that I'm now, and even for years before now, I've known that God, not that I was special in any way, but that God saw that he was going to need me. He was going to need me to be a little mother to my younger brother and sister. And that's why, when my twin brother died, when I believe my father took his life, he could have taken me too. However, my twin brother died. I could have died instead of him or with him, but God knew he needed me. He needed to be that comfort to my mother in her sorrow and her pain. He needed me to be a little mother. And so he set me apart for those reasons. And I like to think of it as now too, that he can use me to help others. That's really what we're here for, right? To care about others, to do what we can to help others through their pain and sorrow and lead them to the Lord. I've just got here every day that we need to be grateful. Gratefulness, thankfulness is a perfect prayer. And any hurt that we have from the past or now, that we will choose not to be defeated or crushed by it, but that we will let God use it in our life to help others. And I'm just going to close with this. It's a little story, it's actually true, about a wealthy woman in New York City. She was walking to church one Sunday morning down a busy street, and she passed this girl, this teenage girl, who was huddled up with her knees up to her chest, just shivering in the cold, up against a building along the sidewalk. And as this woman passed by her, she said to her, "Why don't you cover up?" Like, she saw that she was shivering. And the girl said to her, "I don't have anything to cover up with." So the lady, the wealthy lady, she had a fur coat on. She kept on walking up the street to the church that she went to. And she went inside, and before church, people would go up to the altar and kneel and pray for a while until church started. So she went up to the front and she knelt to pray. And every time she started to talk to the Lord, she couldn't. She just kept thinking of that girl. The girl kept coming into her mind, and she could see her shivering in the cold there. And she just couldn't pray. So finally she got up and she walked back, hoping the girl would still be there, and she was. And she went up to the girl and she took off her fur coat and she draped it over that girl. And then she went back to her church and she could pray. Isn't that a wonderful picture of God and of us? That really, how can we pray until we do something? And even after we pray, if God impresses upon our minds something that we can do, can we really call ourselves Christians if we don't? I mean, that's why he has made us his children, so that we can show his love to others. And I'm sure that everyone sitting here, I'm sure you've had some hurt and pain in your life. God wants to use that. He wants to use our lives in any way he can. And so I just leave that thought with you today, that God can use your life. He can use mine in a certain way, but not in the same way he can use yours. You know people that I don't know, and I know people that you don't know. And all together, all over the world, God's people doing what he wants them to do, showing the love that he wants people to feel. That's when we're truly being his children. So I thank you for this opportunity of sharing my testimony. Every time I tell it, I'm just amazed at what God has done for me. And I know he's done wonderful things for you as well, and will continue to do so as we trust him for all of our needs. Thank you.